holiday like today to come and sit down for a presentation with a stirring, action-packed title like Writing Late But Fun. I know where you're all coming from here. But I thought, given today, might be a good place to start with some events down the turnpike over the hills 233 years ago today, where these men signed the Declaration of Independence. Of course, today it's pretty easy to react with some cynicism about our history, and we can all come up with a long list of examples of when the United States failed to live up to some of the ideals that were espoused here. But it's also, I think, important to bear in mind just how radical a proposition this was at the time. While Europe was debating the divine right of kings, these men were talking about instituting a government with no monarchy whatsoever, at a time when the Enlightenment philosophers were just beginning to suggest that maybe individuals could have rights. These men were talking about setting up a entire form of government based on those Enlightenment ideals. And it's a bit of a cliche to say that this could have happened, could not have happened anywhere else, but I think that there is some truth to that. Not that there's a unique American character that it cares about freedom and democracy where other people don't. Geography certainly played its part. Having an ocean between you and your imperial overlords makes it rather difficult for them to get involved in your day-to-day affairs. You may get used to a certain level of autonomy from that. But more important, I think, is that these men had living examples of how democracy can work from these men. These are chiefs of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the world's oldest living democracy. We have good reason to think that their democracy may be almost 1,000 years old and is still around today. 4 years ago today, Charles Mann, author of 1491, wrote an article for the New York Times called Founding Sachems, where he tried to explain some of the ways in which the Haudenosaunee inspired the examples of democracy that the Founding Fathers were looking at. Yes, you can look back and see some examples in European history, like Athens. But the Athenian example had been dead for thousands of years already by the time that they were sitting down in the Constitutional Convention down the road in Philadelphia. Whereas Benjamin Franklin had gone and studied and learned from Mohawks himself before helping to write some of the founding government pacts in Albany. Charles Mann writes, "Historians have been reluctant to acknowledge this contribution to the end of tyranny worldwide. Yet a plain reading of Locke, Hume, Rousseau, and Thomas Paine shows that they took many of their illustrations of liberty from native examples. So did the colonists who held their Boston Tea Party dressed as Mohawks. When others took up European intellectuals' books and histories, images of Indian freedom had an impact far removed in time and space from the 16th century Northeast." Peter Charles Hoffer wrote a book called Sensory Worlds in Early America, where he described much of the history of early colonial North America, from Roanoke and Jamestown all the way to the Plymouth colony, all the way up to the Revolution, in terms of a contact between two sensory worlds, the world of the Native Americans and the world of the Europeans. And they had a very different view of the world and very different expectations. For example, he wrote, "The demands of English perception required that auditory and visual signals not blend into the landscape, as Indian signs did, but stand out from it in sharp relief. Thus, the trumpet blast identified the English to one another rather than the imitation of bird song or animal call, the animal that the Indians adopted." The contact between these two different worlds, these two different ways of seeing the world and engaging with the world, ultimately culminated in a written document, the Declaration of Independence. And today we have all of these celebrations to mark the signing of a written document. Yet it began with the contact between a literate people and a pre-literate or oral people. And the different ways that they saw the world, the different ways that they engaged the world. And from that contact came the ideals that this document tries to express. So where did this difference begin? Understanding how these two worldviews emerged and then came into contact will tell us a lot about how this deeply enriching and informative contact happened in our own history. And it probably suits to start in our own history Alfred North Whitehead once wrote that the safest generalization of the European philosophical tradition is that it consists of a series of footnotes to Plato. Now, I'm sure some of you know Plato better than I do, but if I may summarize quickly and move on, Plato's main philosophical point is Platonic dualism, that there's the world of our senses, the world that we see and taste and smell and touch, and then there's the world of forms. And it's the world of forms that's true. The physical sensations that we experience are shadows of the true forms that we can only really comprehend intellectually. We know Plato from his writings, and we know Socrates from Plato's writings. Socrates, Plato's teacher, features in most of his dialogues as participants. So why don't we know Socrates from his own writings? In fact, there's a bit of a historical coincidence here. Right at the end of Socrates' career and at the beginning of Plato's career, the Athenian Gymnasium introduced a slight change of curriculum. They started teaching the Greek alphabet. The Greek alphabet had existed for a long time before that, but only at this point did you have the average Athenian citizen knowing the Greek alphabet, knowing how to read and write. And so at that point, Athens became a literate society. So Socrates is one of the last oral philosophers, and Plato is one of the first literate philosophers. In fact, the Greek alphabet had been around for centuries. Homer had written the Iliad and the Odyssey centuries before Socrates. But as Eric Havlick and Milman Perry put together about a century ago, Homer was not what we would generally consider a writer. The Iliad and the Odyssey, if you look at the epithets and the formula that are used, things like wine-dark sea or swift-footed Achilles, these are oral formula. And Havlick and Perry put together that the Odyssey and the Iliad are not written works in the traditional sense, but rather transcriptions of oral performances. The kind of performance that somebody like this might give. This is Kierkegaard's Menashe, who has memorized the entire Menashe epic. The oral tradition dominates human history for an enormous amount of our time on this planet. Literacy arising only very lately, and even now, most people are still illiterate. So, the kind of tradition that this man represents is far more common than the type of tradition this man represents. In the oral tradition, all knowledge is in a social context. All knowledge takes place in discussions between people. And knowledge is fundamentally about making connections. Oral stories emphasize rhythm and flow. You can't go back and analyze what the storyteller said 5 minutes ago. He already said it. That event is past. So there's a present moment in an oral story that you don't really have in a written work. And that means that the emphasis is on where you are at the present and connecting it to the next thing, keeping the flow going and keeping the rhythm consistent. By comparison, a book has a number of chapters. Each one of those chapters is made up of paragraphs. Each one of the paragraphs is made up of sentences. The sentences are made up of words, and the words are made up of letters. If I just hand you a book, you don't get any meaning from the book as a whole. You only start to derive the meaning once you start to break the book down into its parts. We read by breaking things down, as opposed to an oral tradition where we learn by putting things together. By arranging all of the letters in the proper sequence, after we've broken it down like this, we start to derive the meaning. I find it a little bit interesting that one of the earliest Greek writers, Democritus, was also one of the first people to come up with the idea that the universe is made up of smaller and smaller pieces, and if we could find the smallest piece, the atom, then we would be able to understand the universe. This form of learning teaches us discernment, telling one thing from another, rather than just experiencing a flow of story or sound or event. And it teaches us reductionism. It teaches us that the whole is the sum of its parts, and if we can break it down into all of the parts, understand each individual part on its own, we will understand the whole. Benjamin Lee Worth studied the Hopi. He studied the Hopi language and was kind of surprised by what he found. He characterized standard average European languages, including SAE, including English, as characterizing the universe as a collection of objects, or nouns. We use a lot of nouns in English. Those objects have characteristics, adjectives. We have a lot of those too. And some of those characteristics are named. He said that the Hopi, their language was more about verbs. You could go on all day just using verbs and never use a noun in Hopi. For an example, this is a coyote. In English, coyote is a noun. It means a member of the species Canis latrans. There's a certain number of characteristics. If the object in question matches the proper set of characteristics, it's a coyote. In Chinook Wawa, the Chinook jargon of the Pacific Northwest, telepis is a verb, and it describes a pattern of movement and behavior. So, if an individual is hunting a rabbit or sitting on its back legs barking jingle bells in a choir, it's still a coyote. It's the object and its characteristics that define it. Whereas, and the behavior is immaterial. To the Chinook, it's the behavior that most defines it. That pattern of behavior, that pattern of movement. And the characteristic, the object, is the part that's immaterial. Walter Ong in 1982 wrote a book called Orality Literacy. It's still pretty much the seminal work on how writing has impacted the way people think, although many people have commented and expanded on it since then. He wrote, "Without writing, words have no visual presence. Even when the objects they represent are visual, they are sounds. You might call them back, recall them. There's nowhere to look for them. They have no focus and no trace, a visual metaphor showing dependency on writing, not even a trajectory. They are occurrences, events." Ong writes about how words, once they're written, have a thing-like quality. When I say the word tree, it's an occurrence, an event. I've said it, it's over. You can't see the word that came out of my mouth. However, when I write a tree, you see it. It has a visual permanence. Even if you turn away or I take it away, you've still had this experience in your life where you have seen the word, where it had the physical and visual characteristics of physical objects in your life. So when you then have an experience with this tree, you start to wonder about the relationship between the two. The word is thing-like, and this is a thing. So how do the two relate to each other? You can the tree that you can go up and touch and feel the bark and smell it and feel the shade on you is a thing. But so is the word tree that you saw. You don't see it right now. You saw it a moment ago, but you still had that experience. You can't unexperience that. So you might even start to think that maybe there's almost two worlds going on here. There's the world where this tree exists, where you can walk up and touch it, and then there's the world of treeness, that word that you experienced. And I think that this is really the truth behind Alfred North Whitehead's summary of Plato's philosophy, because Plato was the first philosopher to start trying to unravel the full implications of writing for the way we perceive the world and the way we think. And in a lot of ways, that's a problem that philosophers still have not entirely solved. To get a glimpse of another way of seeing the world, in the December 17th, 2007 New Yorker, Malcolm Gladwell wrote an article about race and IQ. And he talks about the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for Children, the WISC test. It consists of 10 different subtests. Some of them have stayed fairly steady over the years. Other tests have improved steadily over time. These tests are generally the categorization tests. You're given a number of objects and you're asked to put them in the proper categories. So, psychologist Michael Cole decided to go to Liberia and administer the WISC test to members of the Kapele tribe. This little girl is a member of the Kapele tribe. And he gave them baskets of food, tools, containers, and clothing and asked them to put them in the correct categories. Much to their frustration, they kept putting they would do things like putting the potatoes and the knives together. Or they would put all of the clothes over with the bag. And they were asking, why are you doing this? This is not the correct answer. The knife is nothing like the potato. Why are you putting them together? And he said, well, a wise man could only use the knife to cut a potato. So finally he asked, so tell me how a fool would do it. And he immediately got it right, put them in the correct categories. Malcolm Gladwell uses this point to illustrate that there are different types of intelligence, and maybe our IQ tests aren't measuring intelligence so much as maybe something else. But I think that this also illustrates an important difference in the way that we see the world. Our WISC test we developed on the assumption that ontology is the most important way of describing the world. That the universe is a collection of objects, those objects have characteristics, and the most important way to organize the world is to understand the different characteristics and the things that these objects have in common. To the Kapele, the world is a collection of verbs and processes. So the most important thing is the relationships between things. The characteristics that a knife and a potato share are not terribly interesting to them. To them, the important part of understanding the world is the relationship between the knife and the potato. You use them together, so they go together. That's the important relationship. The ontology means nothing to them. So, how does this kind of divergence of this basic understanding of what the universe is start to happen? Plato expressed some suspicions about writing himself in his dialogue, The Phaedrus. And in that, he relates a story about an Egyptian king named Thamus, who gets to meet the god Thoth, who is the god of writing and wisdom and learning. And Thoth is showing him all of these wonderful inventions that will help the Egyptians. And finally he comes to writing, and he says, this is great. This is going to help the Egyptians remember things. It's going to make them wise and learned. Thamus replied, O most ingenious Thoth, the parent or inventor of an art is not always the best judge of the utility or inutility of his own inventions to the users of them. And in this instance, you who are the father of letters, from a paternal love of your own children, have been led to attribute to them a quality which they cannot have. For this discovery of yours will create forgetfulness in the learners' souls, because they will not use their memories. They will trust to the external written characters and not remember of themselves. The specific which you have discovered is not an aid to memory, but to reminiscence. And you give your disciples not truth, but only the semblance of truth. They will be hearers of many things and will have learned nothing. They will appear to be omniscient and will generally know nothing. They will be tiresome company, having the show of wisdom without the reality. Now, it's interesting to note that a lot of the early writing systems that have been developed around the world have been considered sacred or magical or mystical in one way or another. Egyptian hieroglyph from the Greek sacred carving. You can see here that the form of the letters, they're painted. They're very explicitly pictures of things in the outside world. And it's kind of a rebus. If you know the Egyptian word for falcon, and you know the Egyptian word for eye, then you can read that the same way that you might read if I put a picture of a bee and a leaf, and you know that it means the leaf. So a lot of these early writing systems also work a little bit like rebuses. Formalized rebuses, but rebuses all the same. The Norse said that Odin hung from Yggdrasil in order to learn the runes. The runes were used for divination, for abjuration, for magical purposes, for mysticism. This is the first rune in the Futhark. Fehu means cattle. And if you kind of squint and tilt your head the right way, you can almost see a very abstract, stylized picture of a cattle. There's the two horns coming up, and, well, as I said, very abstract and stylized. This is the Phoenician Aleph, first letter of the Phoenician alphabet. It, too, means cattle. And again, if you kind of look at it sideways, you can almost see the picture of a cow. Its snout is over on this end, the horns are over here, and you can see the two ears off the side. The Hebrew Aleph is related to the Phoenician Aleph. Frankly, I don't know how. But it too means cattle. And I think if if you squint the same way, you can almost see a cattle. If the head's over here and the hind legs are back here, maybe the tail's sticking up for some reason.
I think there were a couple intermediary forms.
There's probably been a couple intermediary forms between the two. Now, in Hebrew, again, the letters have meanings. Like this one still means cow. It's still a highly abstract, highly stylized picture, but it's still a picture. And still, there are a number of mystical and magical and divinatory meanings associated with every letter of the Hebrew alphabet in Kabbalah, the number of letters and how they relate to each other. It's also interesting that there are no vowels in Hebrew. So a Hebrew text is incomplete until you come to it. It takes the text and the reader to create a final document. You have to breathe life into it, the sounded breath, the vowel. You have to bring that to it, or else it's dead on the page. In The Spell of the Sensuous, David Abram talks about this history of the alphabet in terms of permeability. So you begin with images of things in the outside world. You know, I want to tell you about a falcon. I draw a falcon. And then we get to the point of a rebus. I want to talk about something that is abstract. How do you depict belief? How do you draw belief? So maybe I refer to the sound, the human sound that we use for that, belief. So I draw a bee and I draw a leaf. So I'm referring to a human sound, but I'm still making reference to something in a more than human world, a bee and a leaf. Those become formalized over time. They become abstract and stylized, and you end up with pictures now that are referring mostly to human sounds. By the time the Phoenician alphabet came to Greece, it had become abstract and stylized, and the Greeks didn't see a cow in Aleph any more than you did. To them it was just scratches, it was lines, it was nothing more than that. It was a human symbol. And Greek language just happened to not have as many consonants as the Phoenicians did. So they had some letters left over. So they said, well, why don't we fill in these pesky vowels? And so you had, in the Greek alphabet, the very first time that you had an alphabet made of entirely human symbols that referred to entirely human sounds, to communicate entirely human thoughts. And there was nothing non-human in there. The permeability that David Abram talks about was finally closed. And it wasn't a one-shot thing. It wasn't that we could say, at this point, we were open to a more than human world, and at this point we were closed to it. It was a process by which that permeability was gradually shut off. He writes, "We are the culture of the alphabet, and the alphabet itself could be seen as a very potent form of magic. You know, we open up the newspaper in the morning and we focus our eyes on these little inert bits of ink on the page, and we immediately hear voices, and we see visions, and we experience conversations happening in other places and times. That is magic. And yet as we shut off that permeability, the idea of the alphabet as magic and writing as mystical or magical has also shut off. Nobody ever tried to use the Greek alphabet for divination." Now, Tim Ingold, an anthropologist who has studied perception and how it differs in different societies, criticizes Walter Ong for falling prey to the very types of literary projections that he's trying to criticize. Ong says that we pick words out from the flow of sound. There's the flow of speech, and it comes as an unbroken experience, and from that flow you pick out the words and understand the meaning of each one. Ingold says, if you're picking the words out from the flow of sound, then the word must already be thing-like for you to pick it out. So Ong is still subject to this literary projection. He's still not experiencing speech in the way that somebody who's never read experiences speech. And he says, if we want to understand, if we want to get closer to understanding the way that somebody from an oral culture understands speech, we need to look at something like music. The meaning of music inheres in the sound itself, nowhere else. There's nowhere else for the meaning to come from. Now, Ingold is a pretty dense writer, and I had some trouble. I had to reread a couple of passages a couple of times over. So, slow things down. Who here likes Star Trek? All right, I thought this might be the right crowd. Next Generation, Season 5, Episode 102, first aired September 30th, 1991, Darmok. The intrepid Captain Jean-Luc Picard of the Federation Starship Enterprise is sent off to make contact with the Sumerians. Problem is, nobody can communicate with the Sumerians. For some reason, the universal translator cannot translate their language. Well, the intrepid captain and Sumerian captain end up trapped on the planet's surface with the monster du jour, and they're trying desperately to survive. And Captain Picard eventually and the captain keeps saying this weird thing, like, Darmok and Gelada Tanagra. I have no idea what that means. But then finally, Picard starts to realize, well, the universal translator isn't breaking entirely. It caught and at, and he starts to realize, well, wait a minute, these are proper nouns. That's the universal translator is working fine. It just doesn't, how much else are you going to translate a proper noun? So what's actually going on is that the Sumerian language is constantly referring to Sumerian oral culture, all the stories and traditions. And unless you know those stories, you're not going to be able to talk to them. And in fact, what ended up here was that Darmok and Jalad were these two Sumerian heroes who overcame their differences and managed to defeat a common enemy that led to a lasting bond between their peoples and brought peace, which was exactly the mission that Picard had been sent to bring the Sumerians into the Federation. So they were recapitulating this old story in Sumerian lore. This is a great example of what Edward Hall calls high context culture. You have to be in on it. You have to have the context of the stories that are important, or else you're just not going to understand it. And I love this example precisely because it works on two different levels. Because there's the Sumerians who have a high context culture, and then there's all of you who raised your hand. In fact, how many of you already knew exactly where I was going when you saw this slide up? So for us, we're in on it. We have a high context culture. To you, I can just say Darmok. You know what I mean. Darmok and Jalada Tanagra. In fact, I could use it as a verb. I could say speech Darmoks. And you know what I mean? That speech, our words, come from this process. See, the tricky little thing is that we all are in a high context culture. All of our words have come through this history of use and condensation. Every word that we have began as a story and a song. Tim Ingold writes, linguists are fond of reminding us, naive speakers all, that one word is as good as another for signifying the same concept, so long as the pattern of phonemic contrast that serves to set each word off from each and every other in the language is retained. To me, it may seem that a quality of hardness is presented in the very utterance of the word hard, just as it is presented in a passage of music played staccato. And likewise, the word smooth sounds smooth, as does the same passage played legato. But that, says the linguist, is an illusion born of the frequent association, inexperience, of words and their real-world denotata. If you didn't catch the sarcasm there, Ingold does not agree with this concept. But to linguists, this is generally considered one of the defining aspects of human language. Language is arbitrary. We pick a word at random to describe a phenomenon, and it doesn't really have any relationship with the word. It's just what we picked and agreed on. Ingold, in general, mounts a rather radical attack on dualism. Platonic dualism, Cartesian dualism. He asserts that there's one world, and there's the world that we live in. That's it. There's no other world. There's no world of forms. There's no mystical world. There's no spiritual world. I mean, if there is, it's something beyond our experience, and we've never had contact with it. And the implications of that do get rather radical, because the linguistic orthodoxy right now depends on dualism. There has to be another world where these ideas exist. And then there's the world of our senses, where we hear things and see things. And we come up with a sign in this world to point to something in this world. And maybe if we know all the signs, we can kind of sort of communicate, and we can get into the existentialist argument about whether communication ever really happens, because there are these two worlds that are separate. Ingold asserts that we're living in one world, and that the meaning inheres in our language, and that language emerges from use. Language emerges, it's not arbitrary, it emerges from our participation with the world in an environment that includes humans and non-humans. He writes, for all music viewed in this light is on its way to becoming speech, and there is no Rubicon beyond which we can say that it is unequivocally one thing rather than the other. Conversely, all speech has its origins in vocal music, that is, in song. As Merleau-Ponty put it, once we put speech back into the current of intercourse from which it necessarily springs, it would then be found that the words, vowels, and phonemes are so many ways of singing the world. Not, it should be stressed, in the naive sense of producing an onomatopoeic resemblance between particular sounds and particular aspects of the world, but in the sense of entering intentionally and expressively into it, of living it. The Koyukon are people closely related to the Inuit. They live in Alaska and Canada. And in their language, you have a number of names for birds that have a very song-like quality. In fact, most of them sound very much like the songs that these birds use to announce their presence. In English, we have some bird names that are like this, chickadee or whippoorwill, where we get the name from the sound that the bird makes. But in Koyukon, the hermit thrush in the evening says, "Suki is dio," which is the Koyukon for "it is a fine evening." David Abram quotes a Koyukon man who says, "Sometimes people will hunt the loon, but me, I don't like to kill it. I like to listen to it all I can and pick up the words it knows." A hunter, in a traditional society at least, where you have to get pretty close to your prey with a traditional bow and arrow to kill it, you don't have the comfort of the distance that a rifle affords. You need to be able to understand animal calls and bird songs, or you're going to be hungry. And not only do you need to understand what they're saying and what they're communicating to each other, you need to be able to understand the difference between a territorial call, for instance, and a mating call, or when they're saying snake, or hey, there's a hunter over there with a bow and arrow, he's notching it right now, you guys better fly. You need to understand all those calls. You need to understand the differences between them and what each of them means, and you also need to imitate those calls. So you need to be able to imitate the mating call, so that all the lucky bachelor birds will come rushing to your location. And if you don't have a mastery of this, then you're going to go hungry. And if you do have a mastery of this, in what way are you not talking to animals? Because they're saying things, and you're understanding what they're saying, and you're saying things back, and they're understanding and responding. So, in your experience, they're acting the same way as other humans. The Koyukon language, with hunters who do live with these skills and have mastered them in order to survive, have a language that is so deeply informed and enriched by bird song and animal calls that they have linguistic meaning. So we started off talking about the different perceptive worlds that oral people and literate people live in. And to us, talking animals is the stuff of fantasy. I mean, that's a Disney cartoon. Animals just don't talk. To the Koyukon, talking animals is everyday and mundane. Bringing it back home to the Haudenosaunee that we started with. Sheridan and Longbow, two modern Mohawk, trying to communicate the way that the Haudenosaunee see the world. And that the assumption that imagination, intellect, emotion, and language are interior human functions that come from a human brain is not one that is universally shared. In fact, if you look across culture rather than across population, it's kind of the minority opinion. They write, "Cultures colonized by these conceits tautologically confirm the interior sources of their intelligence. Minds colonized by such conceits think and conceive of themselves in this grammar of possessive individualism. Onwe, unassimilated traditional Haudenosaunee, in contrast, regard any assumption concerning the existence of autonomous anthropogenic minds to be aberrations that violate the unity, interrelation, and reciprocity between language and psychology, landscape, and mind. The ecology of traditional Haudenosaunee territory possesses sentience that is manifest in the consciousness of that territory, and that same consciousness is formalized in and as Haudenosaunee consciousness. Of course, other beings manifest that consciousness in their literature of tracks, chirrups, and loon calls. The Haudenosaunee, living with this kind of view of the world in this particular territory, with a language informed and enriched not only by other humans and the tradition and songs and oral tradition that inform that, but also listening to bird songs and animal calls and incorporating that back into their language, came up with a worldview that emphasized the importance of consensus, that told them that the absolute personal autonomy of each individual should never be violated. By comparison, the Europeans, who had for thousands of years learned from books, referring to human symbols that represented human sounds to encode human thoughts in a purely human world, came up with ideas like feudalism and the divine right of kings and the absolute authority of a single individual over all. Over the past couple decades, eco-psychology has taught us a lot about the separation of humans from a more than human world and how that can lead to trauma individually and as a society. Language emerges in a more than human world from our participation with it, with other humans and with other than humans. When you isolate language from that root, you rip language out from its source, from the things that keep new ideas circulating and keep it fresh. In a sense, when we isolate our language and our thought to only other humans, our thinking and our language becomes inbred. When only humans speak and only humans think, and we have only other humans to talk to, we end up with increasing social isolation and increasing ecological devastation. I'd like to end with a quote from David Abram, who writes, "Caught up in a mass of abstractions, our attention hypnotized by a host of human-made technologies that only reflect us back upon ourselves, it is all too easy for us to forget our carnal inherence in a more than human matrix of sensations and sensibilities. Our bodies have formed themselves in delicate reciprocity with the manifold textures, sounds, and shapes of an animate earth. Our eyes have evolved in subtle interaction with other eyes, as our ears are attuned by their very structure to the howling of wolves and the honking of geese. To shut ourselves off from these other voices, to continue by our lifestyles, to condemn these other sensibilities to the oblivion of extinction, is to rob our own senses of their integrity, and to rob our minds of their coherence. We are human only in contact and conviviality with what is not human. Only in reciprocity with what is other do we begin to heal ourselves."